This is Flare Engine, welcome. In this tutorial we're going to continue looking at firearm. Okay, let's begin. First, I want to mention that the player must have the firearms ability enabled in order to use a firearm. The way it works is that a player can have an unlimited amount of firearms. We will quickly look at this in play mode and create another firearm. Any character can have a long list of firearms. Usually you only want one of them to be activated. So to control them, you have to deactivate or activate the firearm game object. You can do this through the inventory, or you can find another way through the AI, but that will be a tutorial for another day. Just remember that a firearm can be enabled or disabled through its game object. Okay, let's continue to look at firearm. You can add visual elements for aiming to the firearm. The first one is reticle. We create another empty game object and add a sprite renderer. I'll simply use the add sprite for the reticle. We set the reference and go back to rotation by mouse. We go into play mode. We can see that it's always going to be in front of the weapon. We can of course change its distance. And we can also set it to follow the exact position of the mouse. Okay, the second visual element for aiming is a beam. We duplicate the game object and change the sprite. I'll simply use the bullet sprite and change its size. What's important here is that the beam sprite has to have its pivot point set to the left, or else you're going to get weird results. We go back into firearm and set the reference. You can also set the reference to the beam end. This sprite will show up at the end of the beam. You can try this out by dragging the reticle transform here. Typically, this object will be playing some sort of sprite or particle effect. Okay, now we set the collision layers, world and enemy. And we also set the target layer to enemy so we can use the auto shoot. Note, this target must also exist in the original layer for auto shoot to work correctly. That's why enemy was set in both. We go into play mode. Okay, and let's disable the reticle. We now enable auto shoot. Okay, everything worked. Before we continue with the charge ability, let's go back into projectiles and look at the pattern property. The bullet projectile has many different types. We'll only focus on basic. In general, most projectiles are set up the same way, so I'll leave it up to you guys to explore and play with the rest, and read the docs should also help. Projectiles are pulled and recycled. Flare Engine doesn't destroy any game objects. If your fire rate is small, then make the pull size bigger. We'll increase the pull size to 30. Next, we have the projectile rate. This shouldn't be confused with fire rate. The fire rate determines how many times you can shoot per second, and the projectile rate determines how many projectiles are spawned every time you shoot. We'll set the fire rate to 0.2. If the projectile rate is larger than 1, then you can create patterns. We'll set it to 5 and go into play mode. Since we have the angle set to 25, the projectiles will shoot out radially. We'll set it to 0 and change the spacing between the projectiles. We can use negative numbers on the x-axis to invert the pattern. If circular direction is enabled, it will ignore the other settings and shoot the bullets radially. Position flux will vary the start position of a bullet in the y direction by the specified value. We will duplicate the projectile and use this as our default projectile for charging. Okay, we'll change the original projectile to 1 for projectile rate. We'll change the firing trigger to on release, this way we can hold the firing trigger without firing a bullet and charge the weapon. We enable charge and set the reference to the new projectile. The charging ability will give the existing weapon a second way to attack if desired. We will leave recoil disabled. It will work, but it needs updating. The charging ability also has many firing events, but we won't get into those. I just want to familiarize you guys with the basics here. Okay, we will leave the default settings. We will hold the button for 2 seconds. Since the min time is also 2 seconds, this means if we stop holding the button before the 2 seconds are complete, the weapon will not discharge. And the weapon will discharge for 3 seconds, and we'll leave the rest as is. Okay, if you noticed, while I'm holding the button you can see a timer change in the inspector. This is a percentage, and when it's 1, the weapon is ready to discharge. And we discharge. The basic overview of the firearm is pretty much complete. In the next video we will finish it by looking at the firing animation, and then we'll look into other projectile types. Okay, thanks for watching and see you in the next one.